What a lonely farmer discovers deep beneath his failing wheat field leaves him trembling and unable to speak. This ancient secret, locked away for centuries, will not only transform his isolated life forever, but spark a revelation that will rewrite human history as we know it. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video will leave you absolutely speechless. The rolling plains of eastern Nebraska held many secrets, but none quite like the one James Cooper was about to uncover. At 58, farming was all he'd ever known, a solitary life that had grown even lonelier since his wife's passing 3 years ago. His small farm, once part of a thriving family legacy stretching back generations, was now drowning in debt, with banks threatening foreclosure and drought destroying his crops for the 3rd season in a row. The Cooper farmstead had once been the pride of Lancaster County, its golden wheat fields stretching as far as the eye could see. James's grandfather had built it from nothing during the Great Depression, and his father had expanded it into one of the most productive farms in the state. But now, like many family farms in the area, it was struggling to survive in an era of corporate agriculture and unpredictable weather patterns. That fateful morning started like any other, with James pulling on his worn work boots and stepping out onto his creaking porch before sunrise. The previous night's thunderstorm had been particularly violent, with lightning illuminating the sky like daylight and rain hammering against his roof with unprecedented fury. He needed to assess any damage to his already struggling wheat crop, though truth be told, he wasn't sure how much more loss he could take. Making his way through the sodden field, James noticed something odd about the way the morning light played across his land. The storm had carved new channels through his wheat field, creating unfamiliar patterns in the earth. But one particular depression caught his eye. Something about it seemed different, almost deliberate in its formation. Where yesterday there had been solid ground, now gaped a dark opening about 4 feet wide, as if the earth itself had cracked, open to reveal something long hidden beneath his family's land. The soil around the hole was unlike anything James had seen in his decades of farming. Layers of strangely colored earth, interspersed with what looked like ancient stonework. James's hands trembled as he knelt beside the opening, his farmer's instincts warring with a lifetime of cautionary tales about sinkholes and cave-ins. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mysterious cavity, but he could swear he saw something glinting deep within. Something that shouldn't be there, something that didn't belong in the simple soil of a Nebraska wheat field. In all his years working this land, in all the stories his father and grandfather had passed down about the farm's history, there had never been any mention of structures or caves beneath the fields. Yet here was evidence of something man-made, something old, something that had been deliberately hidden beneath layers of earth and time. The practical part of James's mind told him to fill in the hole before it could pose a danger to his equipment or livestock. The bank was sending an assessor next week to evaluate the farm for potential foreclosure, and the last thing he needed was another problem to explain. But something deeper, something that echoed with the same intuition that had guided generations of farmers before him, told him this was important. As he peered into the darkness, a cool breath of air emerged from the opening, carrying with it a scent that seemed impossibly old, a mixture of stone, mineral, and something else he couldn't quite identify. James pulled out his phone to call someone, anyone, but stopped short. Who would he call? The sheriff would probably just see it as a hazard to be filled in. The bank would likely use it as another excuse to devalue his property, his neighbors. Well, he hadn't spoken to most of them since Sarah's funeral 3 years ago. The isolation that had become his constant companion since losing Sarah suddenly felt heavier than ever. Yet paradoxically, as he stared into that mysterious opening, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this discovery might mean something. That the land his family had worked for generations still had secrets to share, stories to tell. Taking a deep breath, James made a decision. Before calling anyone, before filling it in or reporting it, he needed to understand what he was dealing with. He would explore it himself. After all, this was his land, his legacy, and whatever lay below had chosen this moment to reveal itself. As he headed back to his truck to get some rope and flashlights, James had no way of knowing that what lay below would challenge everything he understood about his land, his family's past, and humanity's very origins. The discovery he was about to make would not only save his farm, but unveil a secret that had been waiting patiently beneath these fields for thousands of years. Little did James Cooper know that by the end of that day, his understanding of history, science, and his own family's legacy would be forever transformed by what awaited him in the depths beneath his failing wheat field. James Cooper wasn't always the solitary figure he'd become. Local old-timers still remembered when the Cooper farm was the heart of the community, hosting harvest festivals and barn dances that drew folks from 3 counties around. His father, Robert Cooper, had been known as the Wheat Whisperer, a man who could look at a handful of soil and tell you exactly what it needed. And his grandfather, Theodore Cooper, was legendary for keeping his farm thriving even during the worst years of the Dust Bowl. But that was then. Now James lived alone in the sprawling farmhouse built by his grandfather, its empty rooms filled with echoes of happier times. The past decade had been particularly cruel to his operation. First came the economic downturn that forced him to sell off half his equipment. Then the increasingly erratic weather patterns that played havoc with planting seasons. And finally, 3 years ago, the loss that had nearly broken him completely, Sarah's passing after 32 years of marriage. Their daughter Emily had tried to convince him to sell the farm and move to Lincoln, where she worked as a geology professor. But James couldn't bring himself to do it. The land was more than just property to him. It was his heritage, his responsibility, his very identity. Every morning he still made coffee for 2 out of habit, the empty cup a reminder of shared dreams and quiet conversations that now existed only in memory. At 58, James's weathered face and calloused hands told the story of a life spent working the land. His father had always said you could tell a real farmer by looking at their hands, and James's bore the marks of every season, every struggle, every small victory against nature's whims. His grey hair, once dark as Nebraska soil, had thinned, and deep lines carved paths around his eyes, lines that Sarah used to say were laugh lines, but had lately seemed more like markers of worry and isolation. The farm itself had changed too. Where once stood gleaming silos and well-maintained equipment, now rust crept across metal surfaces and paint peeled from wooden structures. The massive barn, built by his grandfather with hand-hewn beams, needed a new roof. The irrigation system, state-of-the-art when he'd installed it 15 years ago, was now temperamental at best. Even the farmhouse, once the pride of the county with its wraparound porch and gabled windows, had begun to show its age. James had tried to adapt, to modernize. 5 years ago, he'd taken out a substantial loan to invest in precision farming, equipment, hoping technology could help him compete with the massive corporate operations that were buying up neighboring farms. But a combination of bad weather years and falling grain prices had left him struggling to make payments. The bank's patience was wearing thin, and their letters had taken on an increasingly threatening tone. The isolation hadn't happened all at once. After Sarah's passing, he'd gradually withdrawn from community events. The local farming association's meetings, which he'd once led as president, now happened without him. Sunday services at the Methodist church, where Sarah had played organ for 20 years, became too painful to attend. Even the coffee gatherings at the local diner, where farmers had shared news and weather predictions for generations, felt hollow. Without her beside him, his neighbor Tom Whitaker still stopped by occasionally, mostly out of a sense of duty to their 40-year friendship. "You can't keep going like this, James," he'd said during his last visit, eyeing the untended garden that Sarah had once kept blooming with sunflowers and zinnias. "The world's changing. Maybe it's time to consider some options." But James knew what options meant. It meant selling to one of the corporate farming operations that had been circling his land like vultures. It meant watching his family's legacy disappear into a portfolio of assets. It meant admitting defeat. The only bright spot in recent years had been his daughter Emily's success in academia. She'd inherited his father's curiosity about the natural world, but had taken it in a different direction, earning her PhD in geology and gaining recognition for her research on prehistoric cave formations in the Midwest. She called regularly, trying to bridge the physical and emotional distance that had grown between them, but their conversations often fell into an uncomfortable pattern. Her gentle suggestions about selling the farm met with his stubborn silence. James had always been proud of Emily's achievements, but there was a bittersweet edge to it. She represented both the Cooper family's success and its divergence from the farming life that had defined them for generations. Sarah had always been the one who could navigate these complex emotions, helping father and daughter find common ground. Without her, the gap seemed to widen with each passing year. This morning, though, as James stared into the mysterious opening in his wheat field, something stirred in him that he hadn't felt in years. It was the same feeling he used to get as a boy, listening to his grandfather's stories about the land's hidden treasures and secret histories. Those tales had seemed like mere entertainment then, meant to spark a child's imagination. But now, facing this inexplicable discovery, he wondered if his grandfather had known more than he'd let on. As James headed back to his truck to gather exploration equipment, his mind wandered to the old journals his grandfather had kept, stored away in the farmhouse attic. He dismissed them as the ramblings of an aging farmer, full of strange observations about lights in the fields and unusual formations in the soil. But maybe, just maybe, those journals held clues to what lay beneath his feet. After retrieving a coil of rope, 2 flashlights, and his old caving helmet from his college days spent exploring Kansas limestone caves, James returned to the mysterious opening. The morning sun had risen higher now, but its rays seemed unable to penetrate the darkness below. Standing at the edge, he could feel a distinct temperature difference. Cool air rising from the depths, carrying that same inexplicable scent of age and mineral. Using the skills he hadn't practiced in decades, James secured the rope to his truck's tow hitch and tested it thoroughly. His hands shook slightly as he fastened the climbing harness around his waist. Sarah would have called him crazy for doing this alone, but something told him this couldn't wait. The opening was roughly 4 feet wide, with what appeared to be worked stone visible just beneath the soil layer, suggesting this was no natural formation. "Lord, what am I doing?" he muttered to himself, but switched on his helmet lamp and began his descent anyway. The first 15 feet were fairly straightforward, the walls of the shaft showing clear signs of human craftsmanship. Smooth-cut stone with unusual markings that didn't look like any mason's marks he'd ever seen. But it was what he encountered. At the bottom of the shaft that made his breath catch in his throat, the narrow opening widened into what could only be described as a chamber, but unlike any cave or cellar James had ever seen. His helmet lamp revealed walls that seemed to shimmer, covered in what looked like metallic veins running through the stone in complex, almost geometric patterns. The floor was perfectly level, made of some material that didn't match any rock type he knew, and in the center, James had to sit down, his legs suddenly weak beneath him. In the center of the chamber stood what could only be described as a pedestal, but it seemed to be growing directly out of the floor, made of the same otherworldly material. Atop it sat an object that defied explanation, a sphere about the size of a basketball, covered in similar geometric patterns to those on the walls, but these seemed to shift and move in the beam of his flashlight. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber. The acoustics were odd. His words seemed to resonate at unexpected frequencies, creating harmonics that lingered in the air. As he steadied himself and began to explore further, he noticed other details that made his skin prickle with goosebumps. The chamber was roughly circular, about 30 feet in diameter, with what appeared to be doorways or passages leading off in several directions, though most were blocked by cave-ins. The walls, upon closer inspection, weren't just decorated with metallic veins. The patterns seemed to form specific designs, almost like circuit boards, but far more complex, and they were warm to the touch, which should have been impossible this far underground. James's farmer's instincts, honed by decades of reading weather and soil conditions, told him he was in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. This wasn't some Native American burial chamber or forgotten settler's root cellar. This was something else entirely, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about his land's history. As he circled the central pedestal, keeping a cautious distance, he noticed that the sphere atop it seemed to react to his presence. The patterns on its surface moved more quickly when he got closer, and he could swear he felt a slight vibration in the air, like the hum of distant power lines, but more complex, more alive. The chamber's floor, he now noticed, was etched with concentric circles radiating out from the pedestal, and within these circles were symbols unlike any language he'd ever seen. They reminded him vaguely of the crop circles he'd read about in farming magazines, but these were far more intricate and clearly carved into what looked like a single piece of material that made up the entire floor. James pulled out his phone to document what he was seeing, but to his surprise, it wasn't working. Not just no signal, which he'd expected underground, but completely dead. His digital watch was similarly unresponsive, though his old analog backup was still ticking. Something about this place seemed to affect electronic devices. The air in the chamber was perfectly still, and despite being underground, remarkably dry. There was no sign of water damage or mineral deposits that you'd expect in a subterranean chamber, no stalactites or stalagmites, no evidence of the normal processes of cave formation. It was as if this place existed outside of normal geological rules. Moving closer to one of the walls, James noticed that the metallic veins seemed to pulse faintly with some inner light, though he couldn't be sure if it was real or just his eyes playing tricks on him in the unusual conditions. He reached out to touch one of the patterns, and the moment his fingers made contact, something extraordinary happened. The pattern beneath his hand grew distinctly warm, and the geometric designs began to glow with a soft, blue-white light that spread outward from his touch like ripples in a pond. The humming in the air intensified, and the sphere on the pedestal began to emit a similar glow, its surface patterns moving more rapidly now. James stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The glow didn't fade when he broke contact. Instead, it seemed to spread, following the patterns across the walls, like electricity following a circuit. The chamber was gradually becoming illuminated by its own light, revealing even more details he hadn't noticed before. Recesses in the walls that might have been control panels, markings that suggested doorways or panels, and most remarkably, what looked like a map etched into one section of the wall, showing patterns he didn't recognize. "Emily needs to see this," he whispered to himself, thinking of his daughter's geological expertise. But even as he had the thought, he hesitated. What exactly had he discovered here? And more importantly, What should he do about it? Over the next 3 days, James found himself torn between two worlds. Above ground, he maintained the appearance of normal farm operations, tending to his wheat fields and equipment with mechanical routine. But every free moment was spent documenting and exploring his extraordinary discovery beneath the earth. He'd set up a makeshift pulley system to make accessing the chamber easier and had begun cataloging everything he could observe about the mysterious space. His old composition notebook, usually reserved for crop rotation plans and rainfall measurements, now contained detailed sketches of the chamber's layout, the strange symbols, and the ever-changing patterns on the sphere. The more time he spent in the chamber, the more he noticed. The illumination that had been triggered by his touch continued to pulse gently through the metallic veins in the walls, but the patterns seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. The sphere, too, appeared to be slowly altering its surface configurations, though the changes were so subtle he couldn't be sure he wasn't imagining them. On the second day, he discovered something even more remarkable. While examining one of the partially blocked passages, he'd noticed that the debris blocking it wasn't from a cave-in, as he'd initially thought. Instead, it appeared to be deliberately placed there, and behind it, he could feel a draft of air, suggesting the tunnel system extended much further than he'd first realized. James had also begun to experience strange phenomena during his investigations. His watch would run backward for short periods when he got too close to the sphere. The temperature in the chamber would fluctuate unexpectedly, and sometimes he could swear he heard what sounded like distant machinery or voices, though the sounds were too faint to make out clearly. Most disturbing were the dreams that had started. Each night since the discovery, his sleep had been filled with vivid images of geometric patterns and symbols he'd seen in the chamber. But in his dreams, he understood their meaning. He would wake up with fragments of this dream knowledge slipping away like water through his fingers, leaving him with an overwhelming sense that he was on the verge of understanding something monumental. The farmer in him, the practical man who'd spent his life working with tangible things like soil and seeds, argued that he should report this discovery to authorities. But another part of him, perhaps the part that had inherited his grandfather's mysterious nature, urged caution. He remembered the stories his grandfather used to tell, stories that had seemed like mere fancy, but now took on new significance. On the evening of the third day, James finally worked up the courage to climb into his attic and retrieve his grandfather's journals. Boxes of them sat gathering dust, their leather covers cracked with age. As he began to read by lamplight at his kitchen table, his hands trembled. The entries started normally enough: weather reports, crop yields, equipment purchases. But then, dated 1947, everything changed. His grandfather's neat handwriting became more urgent, describing lights in the wheat field and strange sounds from deep in the earth. He wrote about patterns appearing in his crops that didn't match any known farming activity, and about unusual mineral formations he'd discovered while digging fence posts. Most significantly, there was a sketch that made James's blood run cold. A rough drawing of symbols identical to those he'd found in the underground chamber. In the margin, his grandfather had written, "They're trying to show us something. God help me, I think they're trying to teach us." The journal entries became increasingly cryptic after that, with references to them and the others and what lies beneath. Then, abruptly, the strange entries stopped and the journals returned to normal farming observations, but tucked into the final pages, James found a sealed envelope with his name on it, written in his grandfather's shaking hand. Inside was a letter dated just weeks before his grandfather's death. "Dear James, if you're reading this, you've found what I could not. The signs told me it would be you. Though I pray the burden doesn't prove too heavy, what lies beneath our land is not ours alone. It belongs to all of humanity, but not all of humanity is ready for it. Trust your instincts about who to tell. They will guide you as they guided me. The patterns are a language, son. The sphere is a key. But most importantly, the chamber is just the beginning. There are others, connected, waiting. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone will understand that some discoveries need time to be understood. Your loving grandfather, Theodore Cooper. James sat at his kitchen table until dawn, reading and rereading the letter, his mind racing with implications. His grandfather had known about this place, or others like it. He'd kept the secret his entire life, taking it to his grave. But why? And what had he meant about others? As the sun rose over his wheat fields, James made two decisions. First, he would need help to understand what he'd discovered. But that help would have to come from someone he could trust, absolutely. Second, he would need to protect this discovery until he understood more about what it was and what it meant. He picked up his phone and for the first time in months called his daughter. "Emily, it's Dad. I need you to come home. There's something you need to see, but don't tell anyone you're coming, not your university, not your colleagues, no one. And Emily, bring your geological survey equipment, all of it." The morning after calling Emily, James noticed an unfamiliar black SUV driving slowly past his property. Through the dust-covered windshield, he caught a glimpse of a man in a suit, definitely not a local. His grandfather's warnings about being careful who to trust suddenly felt more urgent. During his morning coffee at the local diner, May, the waitress who'd known him for 30 years, pulled him aside. "James, some strange folks were in here yesterday asking questions about your land. Said they were from the Geological Survey Office, but they didn't look like any government scientists I've ever seen. Too clean-cut, if you know what I mean." James's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "What kind of questions?" "Wanted to know if anyone had noticed any unusual activities on your property. Asked about ground disturbances, lights, that sort of thing. I told them the only unusual thing about James Cooper is how he takes his coffee. Black with 3 sugars. She smiled, but her eyes were serious. They didn't strike me as people who take mind-your-own-business for an answer. On his way back to the farm, James spotted another vehicle he didn't recognize parked on the county road overlooking his wheat field. As he drove past, the driver quickly raised a pair of binoculars to his eyes. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. Emily had texted that she was driving down from Lincoln and would arrive that evening. James spent the day making seemingly normal rounds of his property, all while his mind raced with possibilities. Who were these people? How had they known something was happening on his land? Had the chamber's energy signature somehow been detected? His neighbor Tom Whitaker stopped by that afternoon, ostensibly to borrow a wrench. But James could tell something was bothering him. After some small talk about the weather, Tom finally spoke up. "Look, James, I don't know what's going on, but there's been some weird equipment set up on the Miller's Ridge overlooking your place. Frank Miller said they told him it was for soil testing, but I've never seen soil testing gear that looked like that. And those fellows operating it, they've got government written all over them." James tried to keep his voice casual. "Probably just another corporate farming survey. You know how they are these days, always looking to buy up more land." Tom wasn't convinced. "Maybe, but my cousin works for the USGS, and he says there's no official survey scheduled for this area. And get this, someone tried to access the county's historical land surveys for your property. Not just the recent ones, but everything going back to original settlement. The clerk said they had some kind of federal credentials." Just then, James's phone buzzed. A text from Emily. "Dad, got delayed at work. Some people from a federal agency. Showed up at my office asking about geological anomalies in Lancaster County. They seemed very interested in your property. What's going on? Are you safe? James felt his stomach tighten. They'd already tracked down Emily. He quickly texted back, "I'm fine, don't tell them anything. Use the back roads when you come. We'll explain everything when you're here." That evening, as James was securing the entrance to the underground chamber, he heard the distinctive sound of drone rotors overhead. Looking up, he spotted a small black drone hovering at the edge of his property. It wasn't even trying to hide, almost as if whoever was operating it wanted him to know he was being watched. Inside the house, James pulled out his grandfather's journals again, searching for any clue about how to handle this situation. One entry caught his eye. "They're watching now. They sense when the chambers are discovered. But they don't understand. The knowledge isn't meant for them. It has to be revealed slowly, naturally, like a seed sprouting in its own time." James wondered who they were. The government? Some secret agency? Or something else entirely? The chamber below seemed to pulse in response to his anxiety, its patterns shifting more rapidly than usual. He could feel it even through the layers of earth, like a heartbeat beneath his feet. Late that night, as James sat at his kitchen table cleaning, his grandfather's old revolver, a precaution he never thought he'd need to take, headlights swept across his driveway. His hand tightened on the gun, but it was only Emily, arriving in her beat-up Subaru, loaded with geological equipment. As soon as she stepped inside, he could see the worry on her face. "Dad, what's going on? Those people who came to my office, they knew things about our family, about Grandpa's old research. They asked specifically about any unusual formations or energy signatures in the area. They even knew about his journals." James led her to the kitchen table and showed her the letter from his grandfather. As she read it, her academic skepticism warred with the evidence of her own experience. "Dad, I don't even know what this is. But those men who came to my office, they're not going to stop looking. Whatever you've found, they want it badly." "I know," James replied, his voice grave. "That's why we need to understand what we're dealing with before they find it. Are you ready to see something that's going to change everything you think you know about geology?" Emily nodded, her scientific curiosity overtaking her fear. But as they prepared to head out to the chamber, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching on the county road. "Dad," Emily whispered, peering through the window, "those aren't local plates. Those aren't..." James and Emily waited in tense silence until the vehicles passed by, their headlights sweeping across the farmhouse windows. Once they were gone, James led his daughter out to the wheat field, taking a circuitous route through the shadows of the old equipment barn to avoid any watching eyes. When they reached the entrance to the chamber, Emily's professional demeanor momentarily cracked. "Dad, this structural configuration is impossible," she whispered, examining the worked stone around the opening. "These tool marks, they don't match any known archaeological period. And this material..." She ran her hand along the strange metal-veined stone. "I've never seen anything like it." As they descended into the chamber, Emily's scientific training battled with her sense of wonder. The moment her feet touched the chamber floor, her electromagnetic field meter began giving impossible readings. She pulled out more instruments from her bag, each one providing data that defied conventional explanation. "The energy signature is like nothing I've ever seen," she muttered, checking and rechecking her readings. "It's as if the entire chamber is alive somehow. These patterns in the walls, they're not just decorative. They're conducting some kind of energy, but it's not any form of electricity we understand." When she saw the sphere on the pedestal, Emily fell silent for a full minute. Her hands shook as she set up her scanning equipment. "Dad, do you understand what this means? This chamber, these materials, they shouldn't exist, not here, not anywhere. The technological sophistication required to create something like this, your grandfather knew about it," James said quietly, showing her the relevant journal entries. Or at least he knew something was here. "Emily, what exactly are we dealing with?" Emily's face was illuminated by the soft glow of the chamber as she studied. Her readings. Based on the decay rates of the surrounding soil and rock layers, this chamber is at least 20,000 years old. But that's impossible because the materials and engineering required to build this didn't exist then. They don't exist now. She moved closer to the sphere, her instruments humming with activity. The energy patterns are organized, Dad, not random. It's like they're trying to communicate something. These symbols, these configurations, they're a language, but not one meant to be read. They're meant to be understood on a deeper level. As if in response to her words, the patterns on the sphere began to shift more rapidly, and the humming in the chamber intensified. Emily's equipment started displaying rapidly changing readings, some of them scrolling too fast to read. "Incredible," she breathed. "It's responding to our presence, to our attempts to understand it. But there's something else." She moved to one of the blocked passages, scanning the debris. "Dad, these other tunnels, they're not blocked by cave-ins. They've been deliberately sealed, and based on these readings, they lead to something big." Just then, they heard a faint rumbling from above. James's farmer instincts recognized it immediately. Vehicles, several of them, moving along the access road to his property. "We need to go," he said urgently. "Now." They quickly gathered Emily's equipment, but before they climbed out, she took one last reading of the sphere. Her face went pale. "Dad, the energy signature, it's changing, growing stronger. Whatever this is, it's not just waiting to be discovered. It's waking up." Back in the farmhouse, Emily spread out her preliminary findings on the kitchen table. "This technology, if we can even call it that, it's beyond anything in recorded history. The materials, the energy patterns, the mathematical precision of those symbols, they suggest a level of scientific understanding that makes our most advanced technology look primitive." She pulled up some readings on her laptop. "Look at these. Energy wavelengths. They're structured, almost like DNA, but for energy itself. And they're not just patterns. They're growing, evolving. The chamber isn't just a static installation. It's more like a seed that's finally found the right conditions to grow." James thought about his grandfather's words. "They're trying to show us something." He shared more of the journal entries, with Emily watching as her scientific skepticism wrestled with the evidence before her. "Dad, I think I know why those men are watching your property," she said finally. "If even a fraction of what I'm seeing here is correct, this discovery would rewrite not just history, but our entire understanding of human civilization. The implications for physics, for energy production, for our understanding of consciousness itself." She was interrupted by the sound of a helicopter passing low over the farmhouse. They didn't need to look outside to know it wasn't a crop duster. "What do we do?" James asked, thinking of his grandfather's warning about some discoveries needing time to be understood. Emily's face set in a determined expression he recognized from her mother. "We protect it," she said firmly. "Whatever this is, whoever left it here, they chose this place for a reason. They chose our family for a reason. We need to understand why before anyone else gets their hands on it." She turned to her laptop, pulling up satellite images of the surrounding area. "Those blocked tunnels, they're leading somewhere, and I think I know how we can find out where. But Dad," she looked up at him gravely, "once we start down this path, there's no going back. This is bigger than us, bigger than anything we could have imagined." James thought about his failing farm, about his grandfather's secret burden, about the mystery that had been waiting beneath his fields all these years. "Your mother would say, we don't find things like this by accident," he said, quietly. Emily smiled, the same smile Sarah had when she'd made up her mind about something. "Then let's find out why it found us." The pre-dawn hours found James and Emily working frantically in the chamber, trying to document as much as possible before they lost their chance. Emily's monitoring equipment had detected increasing surveillance. Activity above ground, more vehicles, more electronic signatures, more drone flights. "These readings are off the scale," Emily muttered, adjusting her instruments. The sphere's pulsing had intensified over the past few hours, its patterns shifting more rapidly than ever. The metallic veins in the walls seemed to respond in kind, creating complex rhythms of light and energy that made her equipment go haywire. Suddenly, her laptop emitted a sharp beep. "Dad, look at this," she called, pointing to her screen. She'd been running a complex analysis of the chamber's energy signatures, comparing them to geological survey data of the surrounding area. There are similar energy patterns at 6 other locations, forming a perfect heptagon, with this chamber at the center, and look at where they intersect. Before she could finish, they heard the unmistakable sound of vehicles pulling up to the farmhouse. Through the shaft opening above, floodlights suddenly illuminated the pre-dawn darkness. "Mr. Cooper," a voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is Agent Marcus Walker with the Department of Energy's Special Projects Division. We need you and Dr. Cooper to come out immediately. We have a warrant to search these premises." James and Emily exchanged alarmed looks. "How did they know I was here?" Emily whispered. Her father's face was grim as he checked his grandfather's old revolver. "Because they've been watching longer than we realized," he replied. "Your grandfather's journals, he wasn't just writing about his own time, he was leaving us warnings about now." The sphere's pulsing suddenly intensified, casting shifting shadows across the chamber. Emily's instruments began registering unprecedented energy spikes. "Dad, something's happening. The energy patterns, they're changing, becoming more coherent. It's like it's responding to the threat above." The voice from the megaphone continued, "Mr. Cooper, we know about the underground structure. We've been monitoring its energy signatures for weeks. This is now a matter of national security." James remembered his grandfather's words. "The knowledge isn't meant for them." He made a quick decision. "Emily, gather your most important data. We need to—" He was cut off by a deep rumbling that seemed to come from within the chamber walls themselves. The blocked passages they'd discovered began to shift, debris falling away to reveal dark openings. The sphere's pulsing reached a fever pitch, and suddenly the symbols on the chamber floor began to glow with an intense blue-white light. "Incredible," Emily breathed, her scientific curiosity momentarily overwhelming her fear. "The chamber, it's not just responding to their presence, it's protecting itself. These readings suggest it's generating some kind of electromagnetic field, but unlike anything we've ever seen." Above ground, they could hear chaos erupting. The floodlights flickered and died. Engines stalled. Radio communications dissolved into static. "The same thing happened in 1947, James said, pulling out his grandfather's journal. "Listen to this. When they came with their machines and their questions, the chambers responded. The lights in the earth protected themselves, just as they were meant to do. Some knowledge can only be discovered, not taken." The rumbling intensified. Through the newly opened passages, they could feel fresh air flowing. And something else. A sense of invitation, of urgency. "Dr. Cooper, Mr. Cooper!" Agent Walker's voice was more insistent now. "Whatever's happening down there, you need to evacuate immediately. We have readings suggesting an imminent energy surge that could be catastrophic." But Emily's instruments told a different story. "They're wrong," she said, studying the data scrolling across her screen. "The energy isn't building toward destruction, it's creating something. Look." The sphere had begun to rotate slowly on its pedestal, its surface patterns aligning with the glowing symbols on the floor. As they watched, the symbols began to shift, forming new configurations that spread out across the chamber floor like ripples in a pond. "It's a map," Emily gasped. "Not just of the other chambers, but of something else, something bigger. Dad, I don't think this chamber is just a repository of ancient knowledge. I think it's a key to something much more significant. The sound of boots on metal told them the agents were beginning to descend the shaft. But at that moment, the sphere emitted a pulse of energy that made the air itself seem to crystallize. The chamber's illumination shifted, and suddenly one of the newly opened passages blazed with light. "Your grandfather's journal," Emily said quickly. "Did he ever mention where the tunnels led?" James flipped through the pages frantically. "Here. The paths beneath lead to understanding, but only for those who are ready to receive it. When the time comes, the lights will show the way." They could hear the agents getting closer, their boots clanging on the metal rungs of the shaft. Emily's equipment was showing energy readings that defied explanation, and the sphere's pulsing had synchronized with the glowing symbols on the floor, creating a pattern that seemed to point toward the illuminated passage. "Dad," Emily said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them, "I think we have to make a choice. Right now." James looked at the shaft where the agents were descending, then at the glowing passage that seemed to beckon them forward. He thought about his grandfather's lifetime of keeping this secret, about the responsibility that had been passed down to him. "Some knowledge can only be discovered," he repeated softly, then grabbed Emily's hand. "Run!" As James and Emily raced down the illuminated passage, the chamber behind them erupted in a cascade of light and energy. They could hear shouts of confusion from the agents as their equipment failed, and the sphere's protective mechanisms activated. The tunnel ahead of them seemed to respond to their presence, lighting their way with a soft blue-white glow that emanated from the same metallic veins they'd seen in the main chamber. "The energy signatures are getting stronger," Emily called out, glancing at her one remaining functioning device. "It's like the tunnel is leading us somewhere specific. These patterns in the walls, they're not random. They're forming some kind of sequence." The passage descended at a gentle angle, curving in what Emily's scientific mind recognized as a perfect logarithmic spiral. The walls were covered in the same mysterious symbols they'd seen in the main chamber, but here they seemed to tell a story, flowing from one pattern to the next in what appeared to be a deliberate sequence. After what felt like several minutes of running, they emerged into a space that made the first chamber look modest by comparison. It was a vast, circular cavern, at least 100 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that seemed to capture and amplify the light from the metallic veins. But it was what stood in the center that stopped them in their tracks. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, her scientific detachment completely abandoned. "Dad, are you seeing this?" In the center of the cavern stood what could only be described as a tree, but unlike any tree that had ever grown on Earth. It appeared to be made of the same crystalline material as the sphere, its trunk and branches, composed of intricate geometric patterns that shifted and flowed like liquid mathematics. The leaves were patterns of pure light, casting ever-changing shadows that danced across the cavern walls. "Your grandfather saw this," James said softly, pulling out the journal with trembling hands. "Listen, the heart of it all is not a machine or a weapon, as they fear. It is life itself, showing us what we could become. The tree of knowledge, not of good and evil, but of understanding, each branch a path, each leaf a possibility." Emily's remaining instrument was registering energy patterns that made her previous readings look insignificant. "Dad, this structure, it's not just generating energy, it's processing information, the patterns, the sequences. It's like a biological quantum computer, but operating on principles we haven't even theorized yet." As they approached the tree, its patterns began to respond to their presence. The light leaves shifted, creating configurations that seemed to reach out toward them. The air itself felt charged with potential, and both James and Emily felt a strange sensation, as if their consciousness was being gently expanded. "Look at the floor," Emily gasped. Around the base of the tree, concentric circles of symbols told a story through mathematical patterns. As her eyes followed them, understanding seemed to flow directly into her mind. Dad, this is the history of Earth, not just human history, all of it, from the first formation of molecules to the emergence of consciousness itself. James touched one of the patterns, and suddenly the entire cavern came alive with projected images. They saw the formation of the planet, the emergence of life, the long dance of evolution. But there was more. They saw other worlds, other possibilities, other forms of consciousness that had emerged across the cosmos. They were never trying to hide it from us, James realized, remembering his grandfather's words. They were waiting for us to be ready to understand it. The chambers, the spheres, this tree, they're all part of a teaching system. Emily was rapidly taking notes, her scientist's mind struggling to process what she was seeing. These patterns suggest that consciousness itself is a fundamental force of the universe, like gravity or electromagnetism. This tree, it's not just a storage system, it's a bridge between different forms of consciousness, different ways of understanding reality. The sound of distant voices echoing through the tunnels reminded them they weren't alone, but the tree seemed to respond to their awareness of the threat. Its patterns shifted again, and new passages opened in the cavern walls, each glowing with a different color of light. "Dad, look at this," Emily said, decoding a sequence of symbols near their feet. "These passages, they lead to other chambers, other trees. They're all connected in a network that spans the entire planet. And each one holds different knowledge, different aspects of understanding." James thought about his failing farm above, about the drought and the changing climate that had threatened his way of life. But now he understood the chambers weren't just about preserving ancient knowledge. They were about showing humanity a way forward. "Your grandfather understood part of it," Emily said, reading more of the patterns. "These systems, they're not just about energy or information. They're about harmony, about showing us how to live in balance with the planet itself. The farming techniques you and Grandpa used, working with nature instead of against it, you were already practicing what this is teaching, just on a smaller scale." The voices were getting closer, but now they could hear confusion and awe in them, rather than threats. The tree's energy had affected the agents too, shifting their understanding just as it had shifted James and Emily's. "They're not going to be able to keep this secret," James said, watching as the tree's patterns continued to evolve and change. "Not anymore," Emily smiled, touching one of the light leaves gently. "I don't think that's the point anymore, Dad. Look." She pointed to a new pattern forming in the tree's structure. "It's not about keeping secrets. It's about being ready to understand them. And maybe we finally are." As Agent Walker and his team finally entered the great cavern, their flashlights and equipment flickering in the crystalline tree's energy field. The scene before them defied all their training and expectations. Instead of the weapon or advanced technology they'd feared, they found themselves facing something that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. "Dr. Cooper," Agent Walker called out, his voice less commanding now, filled with a mix of awe and uncertainty. "We need you and your father to step away from that structure. Dativou." But even as he spoke, the tree's patterns were affecting everyone in the chamber, its light leaves casting enlightening shadows that seemed to speak directly to each person's consciousness. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Emily responded, her voice steady as she continued to decode the symbols. "This isn't a threat to national security. It's an invitation to planetary awakening. These patterns, they're showing us how to solve the very problems that are threatening our world." The tree's energy field intensified, and suddenly the cavern was filled with holographic projections, solutions to climate change, sustainable energy systems, healing technologies that worked in harmony with nature rather than against it. But more than that, it showed the interconnectedness of all things, the delicate balance that existed between consciousness, technology, and the natural world. My God, one of the younger agents whispered, lowering his weapon as he watched a display of how the Earth's ecosystems were meant to function in harmony. This is incredible. James stepped forward, holding his grandfather's journal. 40 years ago, you came here looking for weapons or advanced technology. My grandfather protected this place because he understood what you didn't, that some discoveries can only be understood when we're ready to receive them. Look around you. Does this look like a weapon? Agent Walker's team had spread out around the chamber, their instruments recording impossible readings, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. The tree's patterns seemed to respond to each person differently, showing them exactly what they needed to understand. The security protocols are clear, Walker said, but his voice lacked conviction. This kind of discovery needs to be contained, studied in a controlled environment. You can't contain this, Emily said, gesturing to the newly opened passages. These chambers form a network across the entire planet. They're all awakening now, all responding to humanity's need. The real question isn't how to control this knowledge. It's whether we're ready to use it wisely. As if in response to her words, the tree's patterns shifted again, and new holographic images filled the chamber. They showed two possible futures, one of continued conflict and environmental destruction, and another of harmony and advancement, where human technology and consciousness evolve together in balance with nature. These chambers, Emily continued, her scientific mind racing with implications, they're not just repositories of knowledge. They're seed points for a new kind of civilization, one that understands that true advancement comes from cooperation, not control, from harmony, not dominance. James watched as the agents' expressions changed, their training warring with the direct experience of something beyond their paradigm. He thought about his grandfather, about the burden of knowledge he'd carried, and understood now that the real test wasn't in keeping the secret. It was in knowing when to share it. Agent Walker, James said quietly, your superiors sent you here because they detected energy signatures they couldn't explain. But what's happening here isn't about energy. At least not the kind you can measure with instruments. It's about choice. The same choice humanity has always faced. Will we learn to work with nature's wisdom or try to dominate it? The trees' patterns pulsed in response, and suddenly each person in the chamber experienced a moment of profound connection with each other, with the earth, with the vast network of consciousness that the chambers represented. It was impossible to maintain fear or suspicion in the face of such direct understanding. Walker holstered his weapon, his face showing the impact of what he'd experienced. Even if I wanted to contain this, he said slowly, I don't think we can. This is bigger than any agency, any government. That's right, Emily agreed, but we can help people understand it. These chambers, they're teaching systems designed to help us grasp concepts our science is only beginning to approach. We don't need to control this knowledge. We need to learn from it. As if acknowledging their realization, the crystalline tree's patterns shifted into a new configuration. The light leaves began to pulse in a rhythm that matched the human heartbeat, creating a harmony that everyone in the chamber could feel. There will be others, Walker warned. Other agencies, other interests. Not everyone will understand or accept this. James thought about his failing farm above, about the years of struggling against nature instead of working with it. Then we make sure they experience it for themselves, he said. Just as my grandfather understood, some truths can't be explained. They have to be experienced. The tree's energy field expanded, and new patterns began to form in its structure. Emily's eyes widened as she decoded them. Dad, look! It's showing us how to begin, how to help others understand without overwhelming them. It's giving us a pathway to share this knowledge. As the agents and the Coopers stood in the chamber, The crystalline tree continued its ancient work of bridging consciousness with understanding, showing them all that the greatest discoveries don't come from force or control, but from readiness to receive wisdom that has waited patiently for humanity to evolve enough to grasp it. The Cooper farm had transformed beyond recognition. Where withered wheat fields once struggled against drought, now flourished experimental gardens that demonstrated the principles learned from the crystalline tree. The old farmhouse had become a center for what the media called integrative agricultural studies, though James and Emily knew it was much more than that. Researchers from around the world now made pilgrimages to the farm, not to study advanced technology or weapons, but to understand a new way of working with the Earth's natural systems. The knowledge from the chambers had revolutionized their understanding of everything from soil microbiomes to weather patterns. It's amazing how much everything has changed, Emily remarked one morning, standing with her father on the porch. Below them, a group of scientists and farmers were gathered around one of the demonstration plots, where crops grew with unprecedented vigor, using methods that seemed to defy conventional agriculture. James watched as patterns of light occasionally flickered through the soil, subtle reminders of the vast network that lay beneath their feet. The crystalline tree's influence had gradually spread through the ground itself, creating what Emily called living circuits that helped restore natural balance to the ecosystem. "Your grandfather would be proud," came Agent Walker's voice as he approached the porch. After the initial discovery, he had become one of their strongest allies, helping to protect the site from those who might have tried to exploit it. Though I doubt even he could have imagined this, the former government agent now served as a liaison between the Cooper Research Center and various international organizations that were implementing the chamber's teachings. His presence had helped legitimize their work in the eyes of those who might have remained skeptical. "The other chambers are awakening faster now," Emily said, reviewing data on her tablet. Similar sites had been discovered across the globe, in the Gobi Desert, beneath the Amazon rainforest, under the ice in Antarctica. Each one held different aspects of the knowledge, but all were connected in a vast network of living information. "The agricultural implementations alone have exceeded our wildest expectations," she continued. "Crop yields are up 300%, while water usage is down 60%. The soil regeneration techniques have reversed desertification in areas we thought were lost forever." But the changes went far beyond agriculture. The chamber's influence had begun to shift humanity's relationship with the planet in fundamental ways. The crystalline technologies they'd learned to work with operated on principles that merged consciousness with natural processes, creating solutions that worked in harmony with Earth's systems rather than against them. James walked down to the demonstration plot, where a farmer from Kenya was sharing her experience implementing the new methods. "It's like the land itself is teaching us," she was saying. "The more we listen, the more we learn." The old farmer smiled, remembering his own journey from skepticism to understanding. The failing farm he'd nearly lost had become a beacon of hope, showing others that another way was possible. The chambers hadn't just provided technical knowledge, they'd helped humanity remember its role as stewards rather than conquerors of the natural world. Inside the farmhouse, now converted into a research center, walls of monitors displayed data from chamber sites around the world. Each one showed the same pattern. As people learned to work with the knowledge rather than try to control it, solutions to seemingly insurmountable problems began to emerge. The latest readings from the European site are fascinating, one of Emily's colleagues reported. They're showing how ancient farming practices actually aligned with the principles we're learning from the chambers. It's as if our ancestors understood some of this intuitively, but we lost touch with it as we became more technologically focused. The crystalline tree beneath the Cooper farm continued to evolve, its patterns growing more complex as humanity's understanding deepened. It had become clear that the chambers weren't just preserving ancient knowledge, they were living libraries that grew and adapted along with those who studied them. "You know what amazes me most?" James said to Emily as they walked the perimeter of the farm that evening. "How something so advanced could teach us something so simple, that everything is connected. The soil, the plants, the weather, consciousness itself. It's all part of one living system." Emily nodded, watching as the sunset created patterns of light that seemed to dance with the subtle energies now flowing through the land. "The chambers didn't just give us technology," she replied. "They showed us a new way of seeing ourselves as part of nature rather than separate from it." As darkness fell, the faint glow of the crystalline networks could be seen tracing patterns through the soil, a visible reminder of the profound changes that had begun on a failing farm in Nebraska. The knowledge that had waited patiently beneath. The earth was finally bearing fruit, helping humanity face its greatest challenges with wisdom that bridged the ancient and the futuristic. James thought about his grandfather's journal, now preserved in the research center's library. The old man had understood something fundamental, that some discoveries come not from forcing nature to yield its secrets, but from being ready to receive the wisdom it offers freely to those who learn to listen. News of the Cooper farm discovery spread across the globe like ripples in a pond. At first, mainstream media treated it with skepticism, just another rural mystery, they thought. But then, the chambers began awakening in other locations, each activation precisely timed and coordinated through the ancient network that had lain dormant for millennia. In the highlands of Tibet, monks reported strange lights emanating from beneath an ancient monastery. When investigators arrived, they found symbols identical to those in the Cooper chamber, carved into rocks that carbon dating proved to be over 20,000 years old. The patterns began glowing with the same blue-white light, leading to another crystalline tree chamber. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, indigenous elders who had protected sacred caves for generations suddenly understood why. Their oral histories had spoken of roots of light beneath the earth, waiting for the right moment to flower in the minds of men. When their chamber activated, the patterns matched perfectly with their ancient cave paintings. Emily found herself traveling between sites, her expertise now crucial in helping others understand what was happening. "Each chamber has its own specialty," she explained during a UN emergency session. "The Tibet chamber seems focused on consciousness and energy manipulation. The Amazon chamber reveals incredible biological knowledge, cures for diseases we thought, incurable ways to restore damaged ecosystems." James remained at the farm, helping coordinate the growing network of researchers and spiritual leaders who recognized the profound significance of what was occurring. His kitchen table, where he'd once calculated failing crop yields, now hosted discussions between quantum physicists and shamans, all working to understand the knowledge being revealed. "It's like a planetary nervous system awakening," one physicist remarked, watching the patterns of chamber activations spread across a global map. The timing wasn't random. Each new chamber activated in perfect sequence, creating a harmonious network of knowledge and energy that began to influence Earth's natural systems in subtle but profound ways. In the Sahara Desert, a chamber activation was followed by unexpected rain patterns that local scientists couldn't explain. The precipitation wasn't just random. It followed ancient waterways that had been dry for thousands of years, revealing that the desert's expansion could be reversed using knowledge stored in the chambers. Beneath the ice in Antarctica, researchers found another chamber, this one containing information about Earth's climate history and cycles. The patterns showed not just how global warming could be addressed, but revealed how ancient civilizations had managed similar challenges in Earth's distant past. The oceans, too, held their secrets. Deep-sea submersibles discovered chambers in underwater mountains, their crystalline structures somehow maintaining perfect integrity despite the crushing pressures. These chambers contain knowledge about marine ecosystems and water purification systems that could solve growing freshwater crises. But it was the way the chambers affected human consciousness that proved most remarkable. People who spent time near them reported expanded awareness, increased empathy, and a deeper understanding of their connection to the natural world. The changes weren't temporary. They seemed to permanently shift how individuals perceived reality. The chambers are like seeds, Emily explained to a group of international scientists. But they're not just planting physical changes in our world, they're planting new understanding in our consciousness. Each person who experiences them becomes part of the network, part of the solution. Global monitoring stations began detecting subtle changes in Earth's electromagnetic field. The chamber network was creating a kind of planetary feedback loop, helping restore balance to systems humans had disrupted. Weather patterns began stabilizing, though not in ways meteorologists could predict using conventional models. Agricultural regions experiencing the worst effects of climate change found their situations gradually improving. The changes weren't magical. They required human participation and understanding. But the chambers provided guidance that made restoration possible in ways modern science hadn't imagined. It's like the Earth has an immune system, James observed one evening, watching the subtle lights that now regularly played across his fields. And these chambers are like dormant antibodies that waited until the planet really needed them before activating. The Cooper Farm became a hub for this planetary awakening, with the original chamber serving as a kind of coordination center for the global network. James found himself hosting visitors from every corner of the world. Scientists, spiritual leaders, farmers, indigenous elders, all drawn by the understanding that humanity stood on the brink of an evolutionary leap. But with this awakening came responsibility. Not everyone welcomed the changes the chambers represented. Some saw them as a threat to existing power structures. Others feared what such profound changes might mean for humanity's future. The next phase would prove crucial, learning to integrate this ancient wisdom with modern human society. As the number of activated chambers approached 100 worldwide, Emily received a message from the network that made her pause. The pattern suggested this was just the first phase of activation. Something larger was coming, a level of revelation that would challenge humanity's understanding even further. "Dad," she said, showing James the decoded message, "I don't think we're even close to understanding the full scope of what these chambers are preparing us for." James looked out over his transformed fields, remembering his grandfather's words about some discoveries needing time to be understood. "Maybe that's the point," he replied. "Maybe we need to grow into each level of understanding before we're ready for the next." Not everyone welcomed the profound changes sweeping across the planet. As news of the chambers spread, resistance emerged from various quarters. Corporate agricultural giants saw their control over global food systems threatened by the new farming methods emerging from the chamber network. Energy companies scrambled to suppress information about the sustainable technologies being revealed. Some religious organizations declared the chambers a threat to their established doctrines. At the Cooper Farm, James and Emily found themselves dealing with an increasing number of unwanted visitors. News vans parked along their access road, while social media influencers tried to sneak onto the property for viral videos. More concerning were the corporate representatives who arrived with briefcases full of contracts and thinly veiled threats. Mr. Cooper, one particularly persistent executive from a major agricultural corporation said, "You have to understand your position. This kind of disruption to established agricultural systems could destabilize global markets. We're offering you a way to control the release of this information responsibly." James thought about his grandfather's words about knowledge that couldn't be controlled, only understood. "The chambers aren't a product to be marketed," he replied. "They're a birthright for all humanity." The corporate pushback took various forms. Teams of lawyers attempted to claim patent rights over the new agricultural techniques. Public relations firms launched campaigns questioning the safety and validity of the chamber-inspired methods. There were even attempts to introduce legislation requiring certification of any farming practices derived from chamber knowledge. But the resistance faced an insurmountable challenge. The chamber's effects couldn't be denied or contained. Farmers who adopted the new methods saw such dramatic improvements in their yields and soil health that word spread rapidly through agricultural communities worldwide. The changes were visible from satellite imagery. Green zones expanding in formerly barren regions, deserts blooming, dead zones in oceans beginning to recover. Emily found herself testifying before congressional committees, explaining why traditional regulatory frameworks couldn't apply to the chamber network. "You can't patent this knowledge any more than you could patent photosynthesis," she explained to skeptical legislators. "It's not a human invention. It's a natural system we're finally learning to understand." The scientific community was similarly divided. Some researchers approached the chambers with open minds, eager to understand the new paradigms they represented. Others dismissed the entire phenomenon, unable to accept findings that contradicted established theories. But as peer-reviewed studies began documenting the undeniable effects of chamber-inspired technologies, acceptance slowly grew. Most surprising was the response from indigenous communities worldwide. Rather than expressing shock at the chamber's existence, many tribal elders nodded knowingly. Their oral histories, it turned out, contained references to these underground networks of wisdom, though the knowledge had been preserved in metaphorical terms that only now made literal sense. "Our ancestors spoke of the Earth's dream centers," one Aboriginal elder explained during a visit to the Cooper farm. "Places where the planet's wisdom could flow into human understanding. We have been waiting for them to awaken." The military-industrial complex posed another challenge. Despite Agent Walker's efforts to promote understanding, some government agencies saw the chambers as potential weapons. There were attempts to forcibly seize control of chamber sites, but these invariably failed. The chambers simply went dormant when approached with hostile intent. "The chambers can't be weaponized," Emily explained during a classified briefing. "They operate on principles of harmony and cooperation. Any attempt to use them for destruction simply causes them to shut down." As months passed, a pattern emerged in how people responded to the chamber's influence. Those who approached with open minds and genuine desire to understand found their consciousness expanded in remarkable ways. Those who sought to control or exploit the knowledge found themselves unable to access it at all. The corporate resistance gradually began to crumble as employees within these organizations experienced the chamber's effects for themselves. Whistleblowers emerged, revealing internal documents that showed how thoroughly the old power structures were failing to adapt to the new paradigm. Perhaps most significant was the grassroots acceptance that spread through ordinary communities. People didn't need to understand the complex science behind the chambers to recognize their positive effects. They could see it in their gardens, feel it in the air, sense it in the changing relationships between humans and the natural world. Local farmers who had initially scoffed at James's crazy light show became regular visitors to the demonstration plots at his farm. They couldn't deny the results they saw with their own eyes. Healthier crops, restored soil, weather patterns that seemed to cooperate rather than destroy. "It's like the land is alive again," one neighboring farmer remarked, running rich, dark soil through his fingers. "Like it's teaching us how to work with it instead of against it." As resistance gradually gave way to acceptance, James often thought about his grandfather's journey. The old man had carried the weight of knowing about the chambers alone, understanding that the world wasn't ready for their revelation. Now, as humanity faced unprecedented global challenges, that same knowledge was proving to be exactly what was needed. The timing wasn't random, Emily observed one evening, watching the sun set over their transformed fields. The chambers waited until we had enough global communication to share their knowledge, enough ecological crisis to need it, and enough technological understanding to begin grasping their principles. The chambers, it seemed, had their own wisdom about when and how their knowledge should be revealed. Those who fought against this natural unfolding found themselves increasingly isolated, while those who embraced it discovered possibilities they had never imagined. The changes wrought by the chambers weren't just global, they were profoundly personal. For James Cooper, the transformation was most visible in the little things. The stoop in his shoulders, worn from years of worry, had straightened. The deep lines of concern in his face had softened, replaced by expressions of wonder that reminded Emily of how he'd looked in her childhood. "You know what I miss least about the old days?" he said one morning as they walked the flourishing fields that had once been on the brink of failure. "The fear. That constant knot in my stomach, wondering if this would be the year we'd lose. It all." Emily understood. She'd undergone her own transformation. The rigidly scientific worldview she'd developed in academia had expanded to embrace mysteries her previous self would have dismissed. Her research papers, combining chamber insights with conventional science, were revolutionizing multiple fields simultaneously. "Mom would have loved this," Emily said softly, watching a group of local children participating in one of the farm's new educational programs. The kids were learning to communicate with plants using methods revealed by the chambers, techniques that blended biology, consciousness, and energy in ways that made perfect sense to their young, unopinionated minds. The Cooper farm itself had become unrecognizable from its struggling past. The old grain silos now served as research towers, their surfaces covered in living sensors that monitored the health of the surrounding ecosystem. The abandoned equipment barn had been transformed into a community center where farmers from around the world came to learn chamber-inspired agricultural techniques. But the most remarkable changes were happening in the local community. The same neighbors who had once watched James's failing farm with pity or judgment now gathered regularly to share in the abundance. The chamber's influence had awakened something dormant in the human spirit, a remembrance of how to live in harmony with the land and each other. Tom Whitaker, James's oldest neighbor, had been among the first to embrace the changes. "Remember when I told you to sell the farm?" he laughed during one of the community gatherings. "Now my grandkids think I'm some kind of wizard because I can grow tomatoes that sing and corn that dances in the moonlight." The chamber's effects on human consciousness continued to unfold in unexpected ways. People who spent time near the network reported enhanced intuition, deeper empathy, and a natural understanding of ecological systems. Children born after the chamber's awakening showed particularly remarkable abilities to interact with the natural world. For James, one of the most profound changes was in how he perceived his family legacy. What had once felt like a burden, the struggling farm, the responsibility to preserve generations of work, now felt like a privilege. His grandfather's secret knowledge, carried so long in silence, had bloomed into something beyond anything the old man could have imagined. The chambers didn't just save the farm. James reflected one evening, sitting on his porch with Emily. They showed us what farming was always meant to be, a partnership with nature, not a battle against it. Emily's professional transformation had been equally dramatic. Her geological expertise had evolved into something entirely new, a discipline that combined earth sciences with the Chamber's revelations about consciousness and energy. She found herself bridging the gap between scientific skeptics and those who intuitively understood the Chamber's wisdom. "It's like waking up from a dream," she explained to a group of visiting scientists. "We thought we were studying separate subjects: geology, biology, physics, consciousness. The Chambers showed us they're all aspects of one living system. The changes rippled through the community in countless ways. The local diner, where farmers had once gathered to complain about weather and crop prices, now hosted lively discussions about quantum agriculture and conscious ecosystems. The high school had started an innovative program combining traditional sciences with chamber-inspired wisdom, attracting students from across the country. Sarah's presence, though physically absent, seemed stronger than ever. James often felt her influence in the way the Chambers had brought him and Emily closer, healing the distance that had grown between them after her death. "Your mother always said everything happens for a reason," he told Emily. "I never really believed it until now." Even Agent Walker, whose transformation from government enforcer to chamber advocate had surprised everyone, found himself changed in unexpected ways. "I used to think national security meant controlling information," he admitted. "Now I understand it means helping wisdom flow freely." The Cooper farmhouse, once a place of solitude and worry, now buzzed with activity and purpose. Researchers, farmers, and wisdom seekers from around the world filled its rooms with multiple languages and perspectives. James had finally installed the new kitchen Sarah had always wanted, though it served a purpose neither of them could have imagined, as a gathering place for people working to transform humanity's relationship with the earth. As the first year, after the discovery drew to a close, James and Emily sat in the old family room, surrounded by his grandfather's journals and new research papers. The chamber network hummed beneath their feet, a constant reminder of the profound changes they'd witnessed and participated in. "Do you ever wonder," Emily asked, "if Grandpa knew what would happen when he kept this secret? If he saw all of this coming?" James picked up one of the old journals, its pages now perfectly clear in meaning where they had once seemed cryptic. "I think he knew something wonderful was waiting to be discovered. But this?" He gestured to everything around them. The transformed farm, the global network, the new understanding spreading across humanity. "This is beyond anything he could have imagined, just like it's beyond anything we can imagine what might come next." 18 months after the initial discovery, the Chambers began revealing something new. It started with subtle changes in the crystalline tree's patterns, configurations that even Emily's advanced understanding couldn't decode. The sphere in the original chamber had started pulsing with unprecedented rhythms, creating harmonics that seemed to reach far beyond Earth's atmosphere. "Dad, look at this," Emily called out one morning, her eyes fixed on monitoring equipment that had been installed in the main chamber. The data streams showed energy patterns unlike anything they'd previously encountered. "It's like the network is preparing for something." Scientists around the world reported similar phenomena from other chamber sites. The Tibetan chamber's patterns had begun synchronizing with celestial events. The underwater chambers were generating frequencies that whales and dolphins responded to in extraordinary ways. Something was building in the global network, a new level of activation that hinted at possibilities beyond their current understanding. "The patterns suggest some kind of communication," Emily explained during an emergency conference with international researchers. But not just between chambers. It's like they're reaching outward, towards something we can't yet see. James had noticed changes in the farm's ecosystem as well. The crops weren't just growing with enhanced vigor. They were developing characteristics that defied conventional biology. Plants showed signs of consciousness that even the chamber's previous revelations hadn't prepared them for. The very soil seemed more alive, more responsive to human intention and thought. Late one night, as James made his usual check of the original chamber, he witnessed something extraordinary. The sphere had begun projecting what looked like star maps, but they showed configurations that no astronomer recognized. The crystalline tree's patterns had aligned themselves with these projections, creating a three-dimensional model of what appeared to be interstellar pathways. It's not just a planetary network, Emily realized, studying the new patterns. The chambers are part of something much larger, a galactic communication system that's been dormant all this time. The implications were staggering. The chambers hadn't just been waiting for humanity to reach a certain level of technological advancement. They had been preparing Earth for integration into a larger cosmic community. The agricultural and ecological knowledge they'd been sharing was just the first step in a much grander process. Look at these energy signatures, Dr. Rodriguez, now a regular collaborator at the farm, pointed out. They're identical to signals astronomers have been detecting from supposedly empty regions of space. The chambers aren't just teaching us. They're announcing our readiness to something out there. The global chamber network began exhibiting new capabilities. Sites that had previously focused on ecological restoration started generating patterns related to space-time physics. Agricultural chambers began showing connections between Earth's biosphere and similar systems on other worlds. The knowledge being revealed expanded exponentially, as if some cosmic threshold had been crossed. James found himself thinking about his grandfather's final journal entries, which had hinted at something beyond the immediate revelations. The lights in the earth are but reflections of the lights above. When we learn to read one, we will understand the other. The changes weren't just theoretical. Practical applications of the new knowledge began emerging. Chamber-inspired technologies started showing ways to generate clean energy that tapped into the same principles powering stars. Medical researchers discovered healing techniques that worked with the body's own energy fields in ways that merged ancient wisdom with futuristic science. But perhaps most remarkably, the chambers began revealing new ways of perceiving reality itself. People working closely with the network reported experiences of consciousness that transcended ordinary space and time. The boundaries between individual awareness and universal understanding started to blur in structured, meaningful ways. The chambers aren't just tools or teaching devices, Emily explained to a gathered group of scientists and spiritual leaders. They're interfaces between different levels of reality, bridges between the physical and the cosmic. The Cooper farm, as the site of the first awakened chamber, continued to be at the forefront of these new developments. The original crystalline tree had grown more complex, its patterns now incorporating what appeared to be messages from similar networks on other worlds. The sphere had become a sort of translating device, helping humanity understand concepts that their languages had no words for. It's like we've been living in 2 dimensions and suddenly discovered the third, James mused, watching as visitors to the chamber experienced profound shifts in consciousness. And now we're learning there are many more dimensions to understand. Agricultural practices inspired by the new revelations began producing food that wasn't just physically nutritious, but energetically enriching. The connection between consciousness and matter, between intention and manifestation, became clearer as the chambers revealed more of their knowledge. But with these expanded horizons came new responsibilities. The chambers were showing humanity, its place in a much larger community of conscious beings, teaching them the protocols and principles necessary for cosmic citizenship. The knowledge wasn't just about advancing technology or understanding, it was about growing into their role as guardians of life itself. "We're not just saving the farm anymore," James said to Emily one evening, as they watched strange lights dance between the chamber networks and the stars above. "We're part of something that's been in motion since before humans walked the earth. The real question is, are we ready for what comes next?" The chamber's answer seemed to be unfolding day by day, revelation by revelation, expanding humanity's horizons in ways that both thrilled and humbled those who witnessed it. The next phase of the journey was just beginning. 2 years to the day after James Cooper first discovered the mysterious opening in his failing wheat field, he stood on his porch at dawn, watching the sun rise over a landscape transformed. The farm that had once been on the brink of foreclosure had become a beacon of hope for the entire world, but more than that, it had become a gateway to humanity's next great adventure. "Hard to believe it all started with a storm," Emily said, joining her father with their morning coffee, a ritual that now felt both ancient and new. The morning light caught the subtle energies flowing through their fields, creating patterns that reminded them of the crystalline tree's earliest teachings. The farm had become unrecognizable from its struggling past, where withered crops once fought against drought, now flourished gardens that demonstrated the harmony between human consciousness and natural law. The old grain silos had been transformed into research towers that connected with the chamber network, their surfaces alive with the same living circuitry they'd first seen in the underground chamber. But the most profound changes weren't visible to the eye. The knowledge revealed by the chambers had spread across the planet, taking root in human consciousness like seeds planted in fertile soil. The old ways of fighting against nature had given way to an understanding of cooperation and harmony that was transforming every aspect of human civilization. "Your grandfather once told me," James said, his voice soft with memory, "that the land holds secrets for those who learn to listen. I thought he was just being poetic. Now I understand he was trying to prepare us for this." The original chamber, beneath their feet, hummed with energy, its crystalline tree now fully awakened and connected to a network that spanned not just the earth, but reached out to the stars themselves. The sphere that had first responded to their presence now served as a key to understanding messages from across the cosmos. In the distance, they could see groups of students arriving for the day's lessons at what had become known as the Cooper Institute for Planetary Studies. Young people from around the world came to learn not just about advanced agriculture or ecological restoration, but about humanity's role in a much larger universal community. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of the old days," James admitted, "when my biggest worry was about rainfall and crop prices." He smiled, watching a group of children using chamber-taught techniques to communicate directly with plants. "But then I see things like that, and I remember this is what farming was always meant to be, nurturing life in all its forms." Emily nodded, reviewing data on her tablet that showed the global chamber network's latest activities. "The chambers didn't just save our farm, Dad. They showed us that everything, farming, science, consciousness, even spirit, it's all part of one living system. We just needed to remember how to see it." As the morning progressed, visitors began arriving. Scientists, spiritual leaders, farmers and seekers from every corner of the globe. The Cooper farm had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, but not in any traditional religious sense. It was a place where people came to understand their connection to the living universe, to learn from the wisdom that had waited patiently beneath the earth for humanity to be ready to receive it. The lonely farmer, who had once faced losing everything, had become a guardian of knowledge that was transforming the world. The daughter, who had feared her father's stubborn attachment to the land, had discovered that his instincts had been right. All along, they just hadn't understood the true value of what they were protecting. "Your mother would have loved this," James said, watching the sunrise illuminate the thriving landscape. "She always said everything happens for a reason." They could see the subtle glow of the chamber network flowing beneath their feet, connecting their small farm in Nebraska to similar sites around the world. But now they understood that these connections went far deeper than physical channels in the earth. They were part of an ancient system designed to help conscious beings remember their place in the cosmic dance of life. As another day began at what had once been just another struggling family farm, James Cooper thought about the journey that had brought them here. The failing crops that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning. The mystery beneath his fields hadn't just saved his farm, it had helped humanity remember its true purpose. "Ready for another day?" Emily asked, seeing more visitors. Approaching up the drive, James nodded, thinking of his grandfather's words about knowledge that could only be discovered, never taken. "You know what I've learned from all this," he said. "The greatest discoveries aren't the ones we make, they're the ones that reveal themselves when we're ready to understand them." The crystalline tree beneath their feet pulsed in harmony with his words, its ancient wisdom continuing to flow into a world that was finally learning to listen. From a crack in a failing wheat field had grown a new understanding of humanity's place in the universe, and with it the promise of a future limited only by their ability to grow into the knowledge that had waited so patiently to be found. The sun rose fully over the horizon, casting long shadows across fields that now flourished with life and possibility. The lonely farmer's discovery had become everyone's revelation, transforming not just a failing farm, but humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmic order. And somewhere, in the rich soil of the Cooper farm, his grandfather's spirit smiled, knowing that the secret he had protected had finally found its moment to bloom.